Well, welcome to episode 327 of 10-Minute Record Reviews. And this time I'm going to devote the episode to the third in a series of guides to jazz record labels. Previous episodes in this series have dealt with CTI and Kudu and also with Impulse. This time I'm going to focus on three labels which are central to the history of West Coast jazz, and those are, of course, Contemporary, Pacific/World Pacific, and Fantasy. And again, this series is predicated on the idea that labels matter, and I think they matter for three reasons. First of all, and probably most importantly, they can greatly affect the artistic vision on offer, sometimes for good, sometimes for ill. Secondly, depending on the resources of the label, they might be able to bring more musicians, better technology, more recording time to bear, or they might not. Third, in terms of the more intangible relationship with the artist, they may be able to support the artist not just financially, but emotionally, socially, and so on over a period of time where that artist's life may be a bit up and down, and somehow or other create an environment which is conducive to making music, or they may not be able to do that. In my discussion of CTI and Kudu, and also in my discussion of Impulse, both of those videos dealt for some period of time with the career of Creed Taylor. And Taylor, of course, was quintessential East Coast based producer. This is a different story. This is the story of the West Coast. Now, of course, there have been many jazz labels based in California, like Norman Grantz's Clef Records and Norgran Records, like Dial, that small but influential label that recorded those great Charlie Parker sides, like Capitol, which is a big and kind of a general label but put out a lot of jazz. With no disrespect intended to any of those, I'm going to focus, as I mentioned today, on the three that are kind of the big three for West Coast jazz: Contemporary, Fantasy, and Pacific. In doing this, inevitably I'll discuss the concept slash phenomenon slash straw man of West Coast jazz, what it is, what it isn't. I'll delve into the history. And music in the years between 1950 and 1960 is a particular focus of this video. That said, I will take at least some of the time to talk about the output of these labels after 1960, as there are some real periods of artistic significance after that point. In particular, fantasy has a 1970s renaissance, so does contemporary to a degree in the 1980s. I kind of hummed and hawed about whether to include those in the scope of this video. In the end, I decided that I would, because I'm unlikely to revisit these labels in another video. But bluntly, while I'll discuss, and I have no intention of disrespecting, some of the great, often late stage contributions by some great artists made on those labels, those eras, the 1970s and 80s and 90s and so on, are not what made these labels famous, and they're not the reason I made the video. One thing you'll find if you're talking with other jazz fans about the phenomenon of West Coast jazz is that pretty much everybody has their own opinion of what it is. For some people, it's a precursor to smooth jazz, it's bop with the edges sanded off. For others, it's a more consciously compositional kind of chamber jazz. You can hear other opinions that it's just another version, just another stream of 1950s bop in its evolution. And some people basically write it off as white guy jazz from California, basically the Beach Boys, except with saxophones and trumpets. There's a little bit of truth to all those stereotypes, but I guess the point of this video is to encourage people not to generalize, instead just put your listening ears on. And if we're listening to it, what is the sound that we're listening to? Well, Wikipedia will tell you that West Coast jazz was, and here I'll read the definition, a subgenre of cool jazz, which consisted of a calmer style than bebop or hard bop. The music relied relatively more on composition and arrangement than on the individually improvised playing of other jazz styles. So basically, it's kind of confected, less improvisational, and you can see where people's biases come in if you consider jazz and improvisation to be basically inseparable, then something which was less improvisational is therefore bad. Personally, I don't think that definition is easily applied to a lot of the music I'm going to talk about today, although it does here and there. It was certainly true, I think, of some of the players that came out of the Stan Kenton Orchestra, which was a progressive-minded but ultimately too large vehicle for some of the experimental music that was coming out in the early 1950s, some of the music which was more classically or compositionally inspired. And these folk did find a home, particularly on Pacific jazz and also contemporary. This is basically a group of musicians who'd cut their teeth composing and arranging for Kenton, also for Woody Herman, and now wanted to try out those ideas in a smaller, more intimate group setting. It's people like Shorty Rogers, people like Jack Montrose, to a degree Jerry Mulligan. But not everybody on the West Coast plays this way. In fact, not even the majority. There was a lot of bebop and hard bop played in the clubs, particularly at the Lighthouse Cafe, which is kind of the center of the West Coast scene if not of the so-called sound of West Coast jazz. A lot of the giants of hard bop ended up recording for these labels, and Latin jazz also gets its first real flourishing as a domestic American phenomenon here. The stereotypical, heavily arranged, mellower type of jazz is certainly here, but only as a subset, and certainly not as the majority of the things that were recorded. Probably the definitive account, even after 30 odd years of music played and recorded in this time period, in this location, is this book by the jazz author, really almost par excellence, Ted Gioia, West Coast Jazz. Interesting book, doesn't really go through label by label, deals very much kind of a person by person sequence, and every new musician is kind of introduced as a subset of the conversation of the previous musician. But it's a fascinating book. And Joya says, and I agree, that what binds a lot of this music together is not so much that definition that you find in Wikipedia. Instead, it's a spirit of openness to experimentation. In these studios, there was no iron hand of, say, an Alfred Lyons saying, it's got to swing in a particular kind of way. Instead, there's relative freedom in the studio, a lot of technical excellence in recording as well. And that leads to a lot of great music, which is really quite diverse, and I would say more diverse than, say, contemporaneous output from Prestige, Riverside, or Blue Note. Another issue which you can't really find your way around, it's like the elephant in the room regarding West Coast jazz and its development, is a question of race. One of the very first things that you're going to notice if you compare, for instance, the records of Blue Note and Prestige in the 1950s with the records of Pacific and Contemporary and Fantasy, is that the leaders of those records, the stars of the New York-based labels, are almost entirely black. Their equivalents on the West Coast are largely white, particularly early on. Is this just an historical accident, or is it due to racism? As far as I can tell, racism certainly plays a part. There's a lot of structural racism at play. The musicians' unions in LA were segregated in the first decade after World War II. This meant, amongst other things, that the white musicians' union were the ones who actually got the work playing in the Hollywood studios, which was how a lot of jazz musicians paid the rent while they were waiting to do more artistic things. Black musicians didn't get the call, and that made it very, very difficult to sustain a musical lifestyle in Los Angeles. This makes a difference when we look to see who was still active and prominent in the scene by the early 1950s when these new labels start up. Black jazz musicians had dominated the LA jazz scene in the 1930s and 1940s up and down Central Avenue, but for a variety of reasons, not all of which have to do with racism per se, some of them have to do, ironically enough, with the desegregation of other venues across Los Angeles, that whole scene had begun to dissipate by the early 1950s. There are a lot of reasons why the formerly vibrant Central Avenue scene of the 1940s had collapsed by the 1950s. One of them is that some of the star musicians, people like Dexter Gordon, had already left LA for lack of opportunity. Others had become casualties of heroin addiction and were already out of the picture when these new labels started their boom period. That includes people like Wardell Gray, Frank Morgan, Howard McGee, even Charlie Parker, who came west for a while only to spend much of his time institutionalized. So there were lots of kind of institutional, historical, structural reasons why black artists didn't have the opportunities in the 1950s. But what about the question of active racism on behalf of the labels? Joya notes that Fantasy in particular recorded almost no black artists in its first decade of existence. In mitigation, he points out that they were not really musical people, that they were just entrepreneurs, and they relied on a very small group of musicians whom they had first started recording, people like Dave Brubeck and Cal Tjader, to find them other musicians, and those white musicians found other white musicians. And while the case against the Fantasy execs is pretty unclear, it is generally accepted that black musicians, jazz musicians in San Francisco, had a heck of a time getting recorded in the 1950s. On the other hand, you'd have a really hard time making a case that either Dick Bock at Pacific or Les Koenig at Contemporary were racist in any meaningful way. Bock is one of the very first people to put an integrated group on the cover of one of his records. He jumped at the chance to record the East Coast stars whenever they were in LA. You can say much the same for Koenig, probably more so. And on top of that, Koenig, certainly in the later 50s, went out of his way to record black musicians who really couldn't even get arrested, let alone sell a lot of records, people like Cecil Taylor and Ornette Coleman. So I don't think that charge sticks against Bock or Koenig. These guys were jazz fans and bop fans through and through. Their musical heroes had been black musicians right from the start. So where does that leave us in terms of an explanation? Well, there are the structural factors that I talked about. When the black music scene was huge in LA, there were no labels around to record, or maybe unwilling to invest. Certainly by the time the labels I'm going to talk about get big, the whole scene in Central Avenue had dissipated. It's also true that the people that were in the Kenton and Herman bands, all these white musicians who show up on these records, many of those people had due to white privilege, I guess, lots of musical training and lots of ideas which appealed to the kind of producers that they were recording for. But none of this explains why some people just didn't get the opportunity. It doesn't explain why Howard Rumsey at the Lighthouse Cafe, who had the great tenor player Teddy Edwards with him in the early 1950s, why he sacks Edwards in favor of white musicians from the Kenton Band. It doesn't explain why someone like Edwards doesn't really get a serious shot at recording until he's a sideman with Leroy Vinnegar in 1957. And while I mentioned all those black musicians who had heroin habits and therefore didn't get many recording opportunities, doesn't really explain why the white guys, total dope fiends like Art Pepper and Chet Baker, would get into a recording studio within hours of getting out of jail almost every time. So really, there's lots of factors, and not all of them are benign, which explain why white musicians in the 1950s had the opportunities on the West Coast and the black musicians didn't. This, after all, was America in the 1950s. The New York scene was the exception, not the rule. So while we shouldn't be surprised the white musicians found things a lot easier in LA and San Francisco at this time, we also should not fail to appreciate that many musicians and executives worked hard to change that reality and change those outcomes throughout the course of that decade with some success. So, having addressed and named the elephant in the room, let's now talk about the music. And let's start with Pacific Jazz Records, which was started in 1952 by the producer Richard Bock and by the drummer Roy Hart. Dick Bock is a legendary figure in the history of West Coast jazz. He was born in 1927 in Syracuse, New York. He came west sometime during or after the war. The producer Ed Michel, who worked for Dick Bock in the 1960s, remembers him as an upwardly mobile would-be man about town who modeled himself on the male ideals found in Playboy magazine of the 1950s. So urbane, pipe-smoking, jazz-loving, well-dressed, and presumably promiscuous. There was a label in the late 40s and early 50s called Discovery Records, run out of Hollywood by a guy called Albert Marks. And Bock's first job in the music business per se was with Marks. His first credit of any variety is writing the liner notes to a Dizzy Gillespie record in 1950. But Discovery Records doesn't really make a go of it, and Marks decides to wind the whole label up in the early part of 1952. Bock, who wants to continue his career in the industry, wants to make a go of it, but at that point he's got no one to record. This is where the origin story of Dick Bock and Pacific Records usually turns to a discussion of Jerry Mulligan and Chet Baker at The Hague. But in fact, it starts a little bit earlier with Bock being impressed by an Art Pepper performance. By February 1952, Pepper had left Kenton's band, partly because he didn't like being on the road, but mainly because being on the road made it harder to score heroin. He had a little group playing at the Surf Club along with Hampton Hawes on piano, Larry Bunker on drums, and Joe Mondragon on bass, and Bock goes to hear them and is blown away. Albert Marks had sold the rights to Discovery to a New York distributor, a guy called Jack Bergman. And Bock asked Bergman if he can record Pepper and use the Discovery label for the release. Bergman says yes. Bock doesn't actually have a recorded production credit on the two singles that Pepper's group puts out, but now he had the bug and now he had a bit of momentum. However, he had two problems. First of all, Bergman was serious about winding up Discovery, and secondly, Pepper, as a pretty serious addict even in those days, was just too unreliable an artist to build a label around, which is kind of ironic when you consider the artists that he would build the label around, but there you go. So Bock hits the clubs, and soon enough, in the spring of 1952, he hears Jerry Mulligan, who had just formed his famous pianoless quartet with Chet Baker and Chico Hamilton at The Hague. He offers to record them, the offer is accepted, and with the drummer Roy Hart also investing, Bock founds Pacific Jazz in the summer of 1952. A few words about Roy Hart, who's often a footnote in these discussions. He was a drummer, a few years older than Bock, and he was of that generation who were too young to be drafted in World War II and therefore were available to fill the seats in the orchestras which had been vacated by those who were drafted. And like a lot of jazz musicians in LA in the 40s and 50s, he made a lot of his money at the time drumming for the film studios. While he's best remembered for co-founding Pacific and for founding Nocturne Records a few years later, he can be found with some regularity in Pacific's catalog, particularly playing drums backing up Bud Shank. Bock runs the label from 1952 until 1965 when he sells up. The label continues on for a while, but ultimately just gets swallowed up. The music put out on Pacific, like contemporary and like fantasy, inevitably changes over time. While there's no one clear moment where things change from one era to another, inevitably the fortunes of all three labels were tied up with the phenomenon of West Coast jazz. And while jazz on the West Coast had been stirring for a number of years, as a recorded phenomenon, it really is the decade of the 1950s that is its peak. When the 1960s arrived, the dawning of the rock era, the migration of many West Coasters to the East, or to prison. While that doesn't necessarily bring the curtain down, nothing was really the same after 1960. So in each case, a lot of my discussion is going to be focused on the music that labels put out in the 1950s, with some discussion of what happened after. So with Pacific, let's start with the earliest phase, the 2 years from 1952 to 1954, when they were only putting out 10-inch records. There were just 19 of these, as far as I can tell. They're distinguished by a catalog number which starts with PJLP. And in that 2 years, there are a number of players, all of whom are really synonymous with the West Coast sound, who make repeated appearances on Pacific. Those include the baritone sax player Jerry Mulligan, the trumpeter Chet Baker, the drummers Chico Hamilton and Shelly Manne, the altoist Bud Shank, the piano player Russ Freeman, and the trombonist Bob Brookmeyer. And in this era, on those 10-inch records, those guys are playing almost exclusively small group, cool jazz with a lot of the hallmarks of the West Coast scene. A number of these musicians had pretty serious musical backgrounds in musical education, and as a consequence, few of these records are what you might call blowing sessions. They're much more worked out than that. These are people who'd cut their teeth playing and arranging with Kenton, with Woody Herman. Mulligan, of course, had been with the Claude Thornhill Band and had already spent some time with Miles Davis and Gil Evans, thinking about the future of jazz in the late 40s. When these guys were with Kenton, that was quite a progressive musical scene, but the vehicle, the big band, was already dated. They bring with them a focus on composition, a focus on arrangement. There are a lot of contrapuntal lines, respectively two melodies playing at the same time. And interestingly, you also get a less is more approach to drumming from people like Hamilton and Mann, very distinct from the bomb dropping, heavy duty stuff that you might have gotten from Kenny Clarke or Art Blakey. So this is the very first one. This is the Jerry Mulligan Quartet, and this is the very first release, PJLP #1. Solid music on there. This is a tremendous one which has Lee Konitz, much more associated with the East Coast as a performer, but of course one of the progenitors of the cool sound, playing with the Mulligan Quartet. Here is one of Chet Baker's very earliest releases. This is actually, I think, his first release as a leader. It's only the third release by Pacific Jazz. This is his quartet after Jerry sadly has gone off to jail for a heroin bust. Here's another Baker release with Russ Freeman. This is the sixth release. This is a tremendous record, and Russ Freeman is one of the real unsung heroes of this particular period in jazz. And the last example I want to give you from this particular era is Bud Shank and three trombones. The three trombones are Bob Enevoldson. I don't know much about Mr. Enevoldson. Stu Williamson and Maynard Ferguson. This is also the one I have, which has Roger Kellaway's stamp on, which is kind of fun, and that conversation with Roger still to come. Then we have the 12-inch era in 1955. In the recording industry all across the United States in 1954-55, the transition from 10 inches and 45s and 78s to the long-playing 12-inch 33 1/3 LP. For collectors, this creates a few challenges because there are new issues, obviously, on the new big 12-inch LP, but there are also reissues of a lot of the stuff which was put out on 10-inch or on 45s, and so you have to be kind of careful you're not acquiring redundant things. And the catalog numbers also get kind of tricky on Pacific at this time. The 12-inch LP being the industry standard after 1955, that's reflected in all of Pacific's releases in 1955 and following. Catalog numbers, as I mentioned, change. Somewhat confusingly, they drop the LP part of PJLP, and now they start just with PJ, which makes sense, but beginning at 1200. All of this, of course, aligns with Allan's rule that record label catalog numbers and sequences never make sense. Much of the music recorded in 1955 and the years following is very similar in feel and style to that which was recorded in 52, 54. As I mentioned, you have to be careful because some of the music which is put out 55 on is simply reissues and reconfigurations of the older 10 inches. This era for Pacific is notable for a number of reasons. You have some of the finest work that Chet Baker ever did in these few years. You also have some of this more elaborately arranged and concocted music, which sometimes drifted far enough out of the what you might call the expected bop lane for people to really find it controversial because it was sterile, kind of this chamber jazz. That was the accusation. For instance, the work of people like Cy Toof. All that said, I have a real soft spot for this music. I think it's been reconsidered in its own right over the passage of time. I think the work of people like Shorty Rogers and Bill Perkins and Jack Montrose really stands on its own as something of interest within the history of jazz. It doesn't have to sound just like a prestige record or a Blue Note record to be a good jazz record. In this period, you also begin to see Pacific seize some opportunities to record people other than the local West Coasters. In this time, East Coast jazz royalty, people like John Lewis, Jim Hall, Clifford Brown, Percy Heath, all show up on Pacific Jazz, the first three as leaders. But those are still exceptions. For the most part, in this period after 1955, you're still getting small group, cool jazz with an occasional noted accent on arrangement. So here are some examples. This one is actually called The Trumpet Artistry of Chet Baker, if you're looking for it. This is one of the ones that has these wonderful West Coast artist reproductions on the covers as well. Some of the nicest pieces of packaging that Pacific ever did. That's just a tremendous, tremendous album. Here is one of those kind of chamber jazzy, highly arranged pieces. Bill Perkins's octets and nonettes and so on were very common vehicles for exploration for people who were kind of weaning themselves off the big band environment. But the small group of fours and fives and sixes of jazz had not yet become kind of the dominant, obvious format. So you get a lot of octet activity. Here's Bill Perkins's octet, which is, again, a very interesting record. Jerry Mulligan, California Concert. This is actually two different recordings, one in Stockton and one in San Diego in 1954. Excellent record, really Jerry at his best at this point, even if we're in the post-Chet era. And here is another of the kind of chamber jazzy ones. This is Cy Toof. It's hard to read because you've got this demonstration stamp, which is so prominent there. But Cy Toof, his octet and quintet. There's Cy there with his shiny bald head, just like me, and a jacket that really doesn't fit. Richie Kamuka, the great sax player, next to him. This is actually a pretty cool record. So things are clipping along. Cool jazz is kind of the thing which has built Pacific Jazz. But then things get a lot more varied in 1957 when the name changes to World Pacific. This is a move which is sort of philosophical in terms of Bock's interest in bringing in more world music, although that doesn't really get realized for several years afterwards. As far as I can tell, the impetus is that Bock starts to record Ravi Shankar around this time. The name change also has implications for catalog numbers, so most now start with the letters WP. There is, however, a small so-called Mark IV series that starts with PJM. But despite the name change and the catalog number changes, you still largely have the same stable of West Coast cool school musicians. Mulligan, Baker, Chico Hamilton, Bud Shank, Bob Brookmeyer all continued to record as leaders for World Pacific in this time. But diversity is finally starting to creep in towards the end of the decade. And you get artists as diverse as Gil Evans, Sidney Bechet, Montgomery Brothers out of Indiana, Art Blakey, all showing up on World Pacific. In fact, one of the only things that isn't on World Pacific in late 1950s is, ironically enough, world music. There's one record by Ravi Shankar, there's one record with Kimio Eto and Bud Shank, and that's it. Some examples of the diversity after the World Pacific name change include this one. Here are the Master Sounds. Here are the Montgomerys, or two of them anyway, with their collaborators in this pretty cool hard bop-ish outing. There is another outing by Bob Brookmeyer, Traditionalism Revisited. Let no one be unduly worried by jazz with a cover like this. There is one of Gil Evans's rare outings on record. The guy has an enormous influence, but really didn't have too much recorded output. But he does put out two records for Pacific, World Pacific, I should say, which also feature Cannonball Adderley. And another one, basically a couple of cool jazz favorites, but I just love the cover of this. It actually has nothing to do with country music, which you might be forgiven for believing if you read the cover, but really, really great tunes. And again, Shank and Cooper in particular, kind of forgotten heroes of this era. And now the 1960s dawns, and it's a farewell to the cool school, or not entirely, because some of the old favorites like Mulligan, like Baker and Shank continue to record for the label. Their style, of course, is progressing like the rest of jazz. One of those changes in jazz in the 1960s is, of course, that soul jazz is coming to the fore, and World Pacific has a lot to do with that. They're recording the Jazz Crusaders, Curtis Amy, Les McCann, and Groove Holmes, people like that. And the diversification on World Pacific continues. In fact, other than the avant-garde / new thing, of which I don't think there's any on World Pacific, you otherwise on their 1960s catalog have about every kind of jazz you could name. The catalog prefixes, of course, get even more baffling. They go back to using PJ as a prefix, only this time they start at 1 till they get to 100, which point they go to 10,000. In all the diversity, there is now, somewhat belatedly, a whole bunch of world music, including no fewer than 14 LPs from Ravi Shankar, which of course were at that point now super trendy, thanks to George Harrison. And there's even some pop music which is creeping onto World Pacific, not much of which is too distinguished, although I probably shouldn't generalize because I haven't really delved into it too much. Some interesting examples of the kind of diversity and pretty good music that Pacific is still putting out in the 60s include well, pretty much anything by the Jazz Crusaders, who, as far as I know, certainly in the 60s, never put out a bad record. This is one of their earlier ones, Tough Talk, which I reviewed earlier in the channel. Here's another great one, Live at the Lighthouse. They're still the Jazz Crusaders, not the Crusaders at this point, but they're migrating pretty rapidly to their funkier sound, Lighthouse 69. Here is one of the great world music pieces they put out, Koto and Flute. This is Bud Shank, of course, and Kimio Eto. And of course, this epic record by Ravi Shankar, he put out a lot of records. This is the one which gets passed around between members of the Byrds and the Beatles and so on, and which causes so much collateral damage elsewhere in the pop music scene. Actually, I love the sitar sound, and this, of course, is the master, so there he is. Finally, this record has recently been given the glossy, I forget, Kraft or Analog Productions or somebody treatment. This is Katanga by Curtis Amy and Dupree Bolton. Dupree Bolton is one of the great casualties, heroin casualties, jazz casualties, who is incredibly talented, spends far too little of his life unincarcerated. When he is out, he does make fantastic music, and this is one of the greatest moments in his career. Can't recommend this record highly enough, Katanga. So, what's the bottom line for Pacific Jazz? Well, provided that you like the things that the Cool School did well, almost anything released up to 1957 is very listenable, a real contrast to the East Coast releases from the same time. I'm collecting what I can of that early era in Pacific while I can, while it's still affordable. After 1957, there's still tons of great music on the label, name change or not. With each passing year, the variety increases, the diversity increases, and therefore the need to be selective in what you're picking up increases. You can't just predict what it's going to be based on the year in the label. Eventually, Bock sells up in 1965, as I mentioned. The label loses even more direction as a consequence of that choice, but there's still quality music on the label all the way to the end. And there are certainly not too many duds. So anything before 1960, generally pretty good. After 1960, worth a gamble, but do your research. Now let's talk about the second label, Contemporary Records, which was founded in late 51 or early 52 in LA. There are two real standout figures in the history of the label. Those are the producer, Les Koenig, and the engineer, Roy Dunan. Koenig is older than a lot of the figures in the West Coast scene at the time in the 1950s. He's born in 1917. He came from fairly advantageous family circumstances. As a young man, he benefited from some great connections that not a lot of other people would have had. He was introduced to the record producing business by none other than John Hammond, who invites him to a Count Basie recording session, the same one where Basie records 1 O'Clock Jump. He went to Dartmouth and he ends up writing for the college newspaper on his two passions, the movies and jazz. As luck would have it, although if your family knows record execs and you're sent to Dartmouth, I don't know how much luck has to do with it. One of his classmates was the son of Paramount Studios' head of production. This connection leads to an opportunity in the late 1930s to be a screenwriter out in LA for Paramount. And while he's out there, he also pursues his other love, music, and he ends up doing some production work for a label called Jazzman Records. All this is interrupted by the war. He's drafted. He ends up making documentaries for the Army. After the war, he gets back into the film industry, but pretty soon he's blacklisted in 1947 by McCarthy's Committee on Un-American Activities. So he goes back to record producing, and he gets a break, kind of a chance happening New Year's Eve, 1948, when he goes to a New Year's party which has a Dixieland group featuring a bunch of moonlighting cartoonists from Disney called the Firehouse Five. As part of their shtick, these guys wore firefighters' uniforms on stage. He asked to record them. They said, well, do you have a record company? He says, no, but if you agree to let me record you, I will have. This is how Koenig comes to start his first label, Good Time Jazz, and Good Time Jazz ends up acquiring his previous label, at least the one he worked for, Jazzman Records, which at that point now, around 1949, was being run by the future Atlantic Records Supremo, Nusui Erdogan. Koenig was making a reasonable living running Good Time Jazz, but it was primarily a Dixieland and ragtime label, and in the late 1940s, that was not the future. As an avid jazz fan, he could see and hear what was happening in the clubs, the whole bebop revolution, And then when the Stan Kenton diaspora began to flap their wings across LA in the early 1950s, it was clear something very new was happening. So Koenig decides to start his own modern jazz imprint called, appropriately enough, Contemporary in late 1951. One of the things that stands out about the music recorded by Contemporary in the 1950s, particularly in the latter half of the decade, is the incredible quality of the recordings. There is this intimacy, there's a warmth, there's an immediacy to the music, and that's all combined with superb isolation of each instrument. When you're listening to contemporary recordings, you're really right there with the musicians. This is basically due to two factors, one of which was the commitment to quality of Les Koenig, who, despite being a small-time operator, certainly at the start, did not scrimp on equipment. He only bought state-of-the-art microphones, and he had very high standards as a producer. The other factor, of course, is the engineering prowess at the label, the work done by John Palladino, who was borrowed regularly from Capitol, Howard Holzer, and then particularly by Roy Dunan. It used to be controversial to suggest that anybody stood on the same step of the podium as Rudy Van Gelder when it came to the sound of recorded acoustic jazz. But what Roy Dunan was able to put on tape in the latter part of the 1950s is pretty much second to none. And I would say I actually prefer the sound of contemporary LPs from that period to any other recorded jazz. Dunan was an engineer whom Koenig had met and been impressed with at Capitol Records in the early 1950s. He was an electronics specialist, that's what he'd done in the Navy, and he was hired by Capitol in 1947 to help them build new studios. He was then mentored by John Palladino until in 1956 Koenig hires him away to be the lead engineer at Contemporary. The setup at Contemporary looked very basic, very rudimentary. It was in a former storeroom, but the quality of the equipment, a very simple signal path, the whole philosophy of less is more, results in scores of releases which are audiophile must-haves. In particular, Palladino and Dunan mastered the art of close miking instruments. And strangely enough, despite his central role in some of the great jazz recordings of the 20th century, Dunan was actually a country fan who had very little time for a lot of the music that he was listening to, particularly if it was in any way experimental. He famously told an interviewer that he would have sent Ornette Coleman home if he'd been the main producer of his first record. But who knows, maybe this detachment helped him focus more on the sound in isolation from other considerations. Anyway, however all that shook out, Contemporary is on the cutting edge of the technology of recording jazz in the latter part of the 1950s. They also were the first label to really take recording and releasing genuinely stereo records seriously. They actually created their own sub-label called Stereo Records, like it was some kind of amazing novelty, which they sort of, I guess, sheepishly deep-sixed after a couple of years. But their stereo records are legit from that era. In terms of the music, again, Koenig had founded this around, New Year's 51, 52. But for the first half of 52, he's still recording Dixieland and ragtime bands on his Good Time Jazz label. The first genuinely modern jazz session that Contemporary does, as far as I can tell, is in July 1952, and that was when he recorded Howard Rumsey's Lighthouse All-Stars. Now, the Lighthouse, of course, from 1949 on, had basically been the center, the unofficial headquarters of the West Coast jazz scene, if not the so-called West Coast jazz sound, because, in fact, most of the music played at the Lighthouse was bebop or bop. Rumsey himself was a bass player. He was a Kenton alum, like so many of the West Coasters, and through his band, which had this constantly rotating lineup, passed almost all of the well-known West Coast players in the 1950s at one time or another. And it wasn't a very big world, so some of the sidemen on that first Rumsey date, the first All-Stars date, are people that are familiar to you if you're familiar with Pacific jazz. People like Bob Cooper, Shelly Manne, Jimmy Giuffre, Shorty Rogers. Basically, what happens is Contemporary starts recording modern jazz at almost exactly the same time as Pacific starts up, and the early years of Contemporary, in terms of the sound and the artists, look a lot like what's happening at their rival label. As with Pacific, there is a 2-year period from 1952 to 54 where Contemporary is not releasing 12-inch LPs because those were not the industry standard. In this time, they produce a lot of cool jazz. It features a lot of the arrangers and composers and musicians who also show up on Pacific jazz at the same time. But unlike Pacific, from 52 to 54, that music is not restricted to 10-inch long players. There are significant numbers of singles and 4-song EPs on both 7-inch and 10-inch formats. In terms of catalog numbers, that includes the C300 and 45-300 series, except for 7-inch EPs, which have catalog numbers starting with EP. But for those interested in collecting only longer formats, there are about the same number of 10-inch LPs that Contemporary puts out, 20, compared to the 19 that Pacific put out in the same time. And with few exceptions, these releases are of the cool school stalwarts with the odd bop flavored release. So we're talking Shelly Manne, Barney Kessel, Buddy Collette, Lenny Niehaus, whomever Howard Rumsey had at the time at the Lighthouse, the great Hampton Hawes. The quality of this music is exceptional, and it includes folks like Buddy Collette and Lenny Niehaus, who are largely forgotten these days but are quite brilliant. In terms of examples, this is Barney Kessel's debut 10-inch. Barney Kessel, again, not somebody who gets talked about a ton compared to some other jazz guitarists these days, I find. Oh, it's not forgotten, wouldn't say. But boy, to see Swing Hard on these early releases, just fantastic. This is, again, his debut. Here is Lenny Niehaus, who also one of these guys who's doing octets and so on. This is something I prefer, which is his smaller group stuff, quintets. Just a wonderful alto player. I thought I had the Shelly Manne Volume 1, but I don't. I have the Shelly Manne Volume 2, which has got Jimmy Jeffrey, Bob Cooper, Jack Montrose, Shorty Rogers, and these guys are all really West Coast legends. And this very experimental record by Shelly Manne. Shelly Manne's trajectory in the 1950s is fascinating. The number of different things he gets into and the number of different innovations he's associated with. He's kind of written off generally as, oh, he's just like this cool school drummer, but he does a ton of really interesting things, well worth exploring. This is called The Three. It's with Shelly Manne on drums, Shorty Rogers on trumpet, and I suppose flugelhorn too. I should probably check that out. No, just trumpet here it says, and Jimmy Jeffrey on sax. No bass here, no piano, so kind of an innovative trio, and really quite avant-garde for the time. Anyway, that's a fun record. It also was released in a slightly longer format as well, in a 12-inch LP at some point. And finally, here again, guys that were also recording for Pacific, Bud Shank and Bob Brookmeyer. Here they are doing a 10-inch record for Contemporary. So when the 12-inch era dawns in 1955, what happens at Contemporary? Well, this I think is the greatest era for collectors of records from that label, 1955 to 1962. In the midst of all this happens the short rise and fall of stereo records, which released basically the same artists and styles, but just obviously in the stereo format. And so the comments I'm going to make here apply to both those labels and also to any records released on Vogue in the UK, which was licensed to distribute Contemporary on that side of the water. Now, just like with Pacific, the arrival of this new format in widely accessible form meant an opportunity to repackage a lot of the 10-inch material as 12-inch records with a couple of extra tracks added. So if you're careful, just like with Pacific, you can actually gather up pretty much all the music released 52 to 54 in newly compiled versions, but it's not exactly one-to-one, so it can be a little bit unsatisfying trying to do that. More importantly, the new music that Contemporary puts out from 1955 to 1962 is some of the greatest jazz ever recorded, and this is the Contemporary 3500 series, and I think in the stereo records version, it's anything which has a 7,000 catalog number. Some of the patterns that we see are very similar to Pacific. We see the same names from the early years, cool school regulars, a lot of the crossover between the two labels. You see music from Howard Rumsey, from Shelly Manne, from Buddy Collette, Hampton Hawes, Lenny Niehaus, Barney Kessel, the great bassist Leroy Vinnegar. You also have the riveting performances of Art Pepper, who, when he wasn't in jail, because of one bust or another in this period, was busy almost sometimes hours after getting out, making records for Contemporary. But intriguingly, you also see some really big names in jazz, not associated either with the West Coast and or with cool jazz, who are making records for Contemporary at this time, often due to sheer opportunism on the part of Les Koenig. On two separate trips, Sonny Rollins makes two excellent records for Contemporary. It's also records done by Art Farmer, Benny Golson, Benny Carter. Again, these were not people you necessarily associate with the scene in LA or San Francisco. And finally, and most excitingly, Contemporary in this period was also the first major jazz label to give seriously avant-garde musicians a chance, most famously by recording Ornette Coleman's first two records when he couldn't even get a gig in LA at the time. People in New York didn't pay attention because it was fashionable at the time to turn a blind eye to what was being recorded by the California labels. But just a few months later, when Coleman goes to New York, their whole world will be turned upside down. So it's really hard to go wrong with Contemporary releases from this particular time period. I've got a whole bunch, just going to show you a few here. This is one of a three record set of releases, individual releases, not a three record set. That wasn't invented until later, by Hampton Hawes, where Koenig basically runs the tape through a session that goes for, I think, something like 4 hours and gets three fantastic records out of it. So-called whole night session. I guess the name says it all. Here is a tremendous record, kind of, old school jazz, but clearly influenced by more contemporary things happening. Benny Carter just sounds absolutely fantastic on this. Ben Webster's on here as well. The tragic figure Frank Rosolino is on trombone. Andre Previn playing piano. Barney Kessel on guitar. Leroy Vinnegar, Shelly Manne. So this is, again, not really a West Coast guy, but paired with a whole bunch of real West Coast talent, and it's just a fantastic record. I just got this the other day, and I love it. Curtis Counts, this reissue, which has a nice little hype sticker actually stuck onto the cover itself, which doesn't sound great, called Landslide. Curtis Counts didn't put out too many records, but is just a wonderful bassist, and this is a really great piece of bop, frankly, not cool school, you wouldn't call it that. Harold Land's on saxophone here too. This is the first of the two Rollins records. This is a latter-day original jazz classics release, which is actually excellent. The original is really, really expensive. Way Out West, this is really superb. It's just three people. It's Ray Brown, who played bass, of course, for Oscar Peterson for many years on bass, and Shelly Manne drumming with Rollins. So it's kind of an unconventional format. Huge winner of a record for Rollins, as is this one. This is a rather more studied performance, which has, as it says, the contemporary leaders, Kessel, Hawes, Vinnegar, and Mann, all of whom were leading records for contemporary at the time. This is just a great record. And I think it's one of the last things he does before he takes a bit of a hiatus and then comes back and makes the bridge. But there's no real reason listening to this why you think he needed to take a break. Absolute classic from this period. Almost anything Art Pepper does on contemporary, or maybe everything that Art Pepper does in contemporary during this stretch of time is great. This is maybe the peak, not really equal. This is with Miles Davis's rhythm section, and it all came together very rapidly. Pepper hadn't met the guys before. There was kind of a sense of seizing the moment when he was not basically out of it due to his addictive habits. Anyway, it's just pure gold, this record. And of course, this piece, there are two pieces here of real risk taking on the behalf of Koenig. Ornette Coleman, Something Else, and around the same time, Cecil Taylor. This record actually was not recorded by Koenig and Dinant. It's actually recorded in New York at Nola's Penthouse, but it's the Cecil Taylor Quartet. Cecil Taylor, another guy who couldn't get a gig. Basically, a guy could start a fight in an empty room or a disagreement in an empty room. Anyway, two really interesting pieces of, well, if not as avant-garde as jazz would get in the 1960s, proto-avant-garde jazz, which was very challenging for musical ears in 1958 and 59, and that's when these are made. So again, real risk-taking by Les Koenig. As the 1960s roll on, the decline at contemporary is much more gradual than at Pacific. You do have that same pattern of the labels established longtime stars and artists continuing to record in an era of diminishing returns for jazz. But the recording highlights continue, like the 1960s work of Harold Land, like the work done by Hampton Hawes in the 1970s, and in particular, Art Pepper's comeback records in the late 1970s. But what I would say is that after 1962, while contemporary releases some great records here and there, a number of great titles, what they no longer were was an era-defining label. They weren't setting the pace, they weren't pushing new boundaries anymore. Koenig died in 1977. The label continued to issue new jazz, often by familiar names, until the late 90s. Now it is, like so many of these labels, just a reissue label. And I don't want to suggest that there isn't good music, great music, in fact, to explore, particularly in the 1980s. For instance, music released by Billy Higgins or Art Farmer or Frank Morgan, who we mentioned some time ago. And I invite viewers who are more familiar with that era of contemporary records to add their thoughts and comments below. My own collection, as you may imagine, is a little bit light in this late stage contemporary, but I do have some favorites, and a couple of them are here. This one by Barney Kessel, I think from '69, Feeling Free. He lost none of his ability and magic, in my view. And I mentioned Art Pepper's comeback in the later '70s. There's a series of records, live records done. This is a Thursday night at the Village Vanguard, and this guy, I mean, he had some weak moments in between, the 50s and the later 70s, but he really is back on his game at this stage, and he's invented kind of a whole new sound for himself too. Anyway, so well worth investigating all these live records that he does around this time. So the simple truth for contemporary records is that almost anything in the 3500 series, or if you want to include anything that came out on stereo records that time as well, from 1955 to 1962, is high quality music recorded to a very high standard. I personally put this body of work on par with the equivalent output from Blue Note. The Blue Notes obviously are almost to a release exceptional, they're beautifully recorded, but to me there is a sameness to the musical focus, whereas combined with the high quality of what contemporary was putting out, there's also greater variety in terms of the approaches and styles. Maybe that's heretical, but that's the joy of having your own channel. Before 55, the music is good, but you're dealing with a lot of dated formats, harder to find. After that, there are some real gems in a long, slow decline, but it's really artist by artist, and I wouldn't really care to make any general statements about contemporary after that point. Fantasy Records is associated with the same era of jazz, the glory years of the 1950s on the West Coast, but it predates both Pacific and contemporary by 3 years, and it's based in San Francisco, not LA. The Fantasy Records story is also distinct because Fantasy Records is anything but the realization of a long held musical dream. The founders weren't jazz fans, they were just businessmen, opportunists, and the history of the label has a whole bunch of twists and reinventions. Story of Fantasy begins in the late 1940s with an outfit called Coronet Records, which was run by a trombonist, a guy called Jack Sheedy, and it also begins with a young piano player called Dave Brubeck. Brubeck had served in the war. He had a pretty elevated musical education, having previously wanted to be a veterinarian, and he'd become part of a movement which was thinking about how to import a classical compositional sensibility into jazz. Unbeknownst to Brubeck, people like Gil Evans were going through the same kind of thinking process 3,000 miles away in New York, but these two streams develop, as far as I can tell, in a relatively unconnected way. As a vehicle for his musical ideas, Brubeck had been experimenting with, you guessed it, an octet, with a whole bunch of folks, including his future quartet buddy, Paul Desmond, and the vibist and drummer, Cal Tjader, and he also had a trio format with Tjader and the octet bassist, a guy called Ron Crotty. In San Francisco in 1949, Jack Sheedy agrees to record 4 tracks by Brubeck's trio and release those as singles on Coronet. Unfortunately, Sheedy was not a good businessman. Coronet was drowning in debt, and he had to wind the label up pretty quickly and sell off its assets. Meanwhile, the guys that owned the pressing plant, Circle Recording Company, that had pressed these 2 singles, 2 brothers called Max and Sol Weiss, noticed that orders were still coming in high volume for the Brubeck singles. So as part of picking over the bones of Coronet Records, the Weisses buy these masters, and they do a deal with Brubeck, and they start up a record company they call Fantasy Records. They steal the name and the wordmark Fantasy from a science fiction magazine, which eventually sued, so they had to change the logo we know today. And the Weisses also had a line in industrial plastics, so they began to press their records in very distinctive colors: red, blue, sometimes green, sometimes purple. In terms of the music of Fantasy Records, first and foremost, it's a jazz label, although there have been some fluctuations in that. There have been some twists over time. But throughout the history of the label, jazz releases are by far the most frequent, followed by the Latin jazz, principally of Cal Tjader, but also of some others. But there are all kinds of other releases which dot the catalog as well, including rock, spoken word, exotica, all kinds of things. They're busy as a jazz label all the way through the 1950s, with output dropping and also diversifying somewhat in the 1960s. That's kind of a recurring theme here. But the quality did not decline too far, and they had a real renaissance in the 1970s. It's only in that early era in the 1950s that the West Coast artists were mainstays of the label. For 3 years, from 1969 to 1971, the label is basically consumed by the money-making enterprise, which was Creedence Clearwater Revival. But as I mentioned, they then rebound to become once again a proper jazz label in the 1970s. This coincides with the acquisitions of Riverside, Prestige, and Milestone Records. And with those acquisitions, the great producer and well-connected jazz man around New York, Orrin Keepnews, comes on board. And his connections brings a whole new set of artists, some familiar names, some less familiar names, to the label. In that time, there's also a full embrace of the jazz fusion and funk trends of the 1970s. In fact, there isn't really a dominant theme of Fantasy's 1970s jazz output, other than the quality is pretty high and the styles range from hard bop all the way to full-on R&B. Keepnews ends up leaving in 1980, and while there are a few interesting things that happen after that, a few more explorations in R&B. Increasingly, fantasy gets swallowed up in the whole mergers and acquisitions festival, and ultimately the reissue scene, which is where basically it resides today. Like Pacific and like contemporary, fantasy has what you might call a 10-inch era, and its first releases are a string of Brubeck recordings. These are with his trio or his octet before his accident in the winter of 50-51, or with the early versions of his quartet, which begin in the second half of 1951. Fantasy's 10-inch output then begins to broaden out to include several releases by Cal Tjader as a leader, including his first foray into Latin jazz. In total, there are 21 10-inch releases up to 1955, of which over half are led by Brubeck, and there are other records which have Desmond with Brubeck, also some records by Tjader. So really, people who were within that original octet world are putting out most of the music on Fantasy. Brubeck, of course, is a bit of a divisive figure. He's not for everybody, not for me on his own, but when Desmond is with him, I think the contrast works extremely well. All these 10 inches have catalog numbers that begin with 3, and they're numbered sequentially, 1 through 21. They include some classic Brubeck sides, including the famous Live at Oberlin. By 1953, with Brubeck's assistance in networking, Fantasy is now recording other West Coasters, or some transplanted ones, people like Red Norvo, people like Charlie Mariano. They also managed to record Jerry Mulligan very early after he'd come to prominence. They recorded him with Chet Baker and his quartet at the Black Hawk in September 1952. And I would say most of these 10-inch releases on Fantasy are worth collecting, particularly the Brubeck, Desmond, and Jerry Mulligan sides. Red Norvo, Cal Tjader, depends how much you like the vibes. I have a lot more of the Pacific and contemporary 10-inches. I only have a couple of this era from Fantasy. Here is the famous octet recording, which was, I don't know if it says when it was done, but this group really was only active until about 1950. Again, it's got Cal Tjader, Dave Brubeck, Paul Desmond, all in this particular group. Fascinating record. Its music is okay. It's that kind of, it's thought out and very consciously compositional, which means it lacks a little of the spontaneity, which some people really like to hear in jazz, but it definitely counts as intriguing. And the other, this I think I can recommend unreservedly, is the record that Jerry Mulligan made. Half of this is a performance at the Black Hawk in September 1952. The second side is done a few months later, and it's the very last set of recordings which Chico Hamilton does before he goes off to do other things. Now in 1955, of course, as with Pacific and Contemporary, we come to the 12-inch LP era. Fantasy's ability to sign jazz stars other than Brubeck was based on Brubeck's own faulty belief that he owned 50% of the company. And because he thought that, he went out there to try and gather as many great artists as he could. Soon enough, however, he found that the deal with the Weisses did not give him 50% of the company. It actually only gave him 50% of the rights to his own recordings. So he was a little pissed off with this, felt he'd been misled, and in early 1954 he says, I'm off, and he signs for Columbia Records. So Fantasy puts out a lot of Brubeck material after 1955. Some of this is original. He does come back now and then to do a few sessions, but most of that output is still legacy material, which they had in the vault or they've repackaged 10 inches. So this leaves Cal Tjader and arguably Red Norvo as the only big names, big jazz names that remained in the label. And then increasingly you could add Vince Guaraldi to that as the 50s move on into the 1960s. He comes to feature significantly, not just in the label's releases, but in its bank balance, because he has a number of hits in the 60s, Jazz Impressions of Black Orpheus, which is a fantastic record, and it had a big hit on it, Cast Your Fate to the Wind. And then, of course, famously, his Charlie Brown records, which are still huge, big back catalog sellers. Other big names do show up on Fantasy from time to time. Stan Getz makes some appearances, his occasionally chaotic lifestyle leading to occasional label hopping. But one of the most central features of Fantasy's output in the late 50s is Tjader's transformation of himself miraculously from this Midwestern guy of Swedish extraction into a genuinely top-ranked Latin band leader. And by the late 1950s, Tjader has gone so far as to attract some world-class Latin percussionists into his group, people like Mongo Santamaria, who would go on to release a whole bunch of LPs as a leader for Fantasy in the 1960s and make a lot of money for them in the process. The Brazilian guitarist Bolacete also features. And this whole period from 55 into the 60s can be found on Fantasy's 3000 series or in stereo on the 8000 series. Most things released prior to 1958 are in mono. After 58, if it's a first pressing, if it's red, it's typically mono. If it's blue, it's typically stereo. But as the 50s wind up and we get into the 60s, it's very hard to recommend Fantasy's output holus bolus. There is also a lot of lightweight stuff here and some outright weird records. Topping that list is anything by Corla Pandit, who was part of the whole exotica craze in the late 50s, where American record labels would put out music which wasn't actually music from a foreign culture. It was music that people imagined music from that foreign culture would sound like. This was a guy who was actually from St. Louis, I think, who claimed to be Indian. He would appear on TV in LA wearing a turban. He never spoke. He just played really, frankly, shitty Wurlitzer organ. But he put out 13 LPs on Fantasy from 1958 to 1963. He had kind of a baked in TV fan base. So, in addition to some of the better jazz records on Fantasy at the time, there was this exotica stuff. There was some B list big band music. There was some ragtime music. There were marching band records, all frankly to be avoided unless that's your bag. There are plenty of highlights from 55 to 65 on Fantasy. Just picked a few out here. This is one of the reissues of the Brubeck material. This is the Brubeck Trio, which put out a few 10 inches. It's kind of compiled here. There are a couple of different LPs, actually, 12-inch LPs. This is one of them with the Arnold Roth comic on the cover. This is the trio with Jader and Ron Crotty and Brubeck, of course. This is Mambo with Jader. This is, I think, Jader's first outing as a Latin musician on a 12-inch LP. He has an all Latin percussion section, but not necessarily of the quality that he would have later on in the 1950s. Great record, though. Here is another one with a cheesier cover, Demasiado Caliente, and this is the one where he's got, by this stage, a Mongo Santa Maria and Willie Bobo on percussion, and really, there's nothing wrong at all in Latin music terms with that record. And finally, this record, Jazz Impressions of Black Orpheus. This was, it's not a bossa nova record, although it is a riff on the music of a very famous Brazilian film. It's Guaraldi's take on some of the soundtrack numbers, but very much a jazz treatment. But beautiful, beautiful treatments. Plus, some other music which he himself wrote, including Cast Your Fate to the Wind, which became a huge hit, made a ton of money for Guaraldi and also for the label. And in fact, subsequent issues of this record become titled Cast Your Fate to the Wind. Anyway, this is a fantastic record, and I recommend it to everybody. In the later 60s and beyond, first of all, as I mentioned, at a certain point, Fantasy becomes CCR headquarters, the CCR factory in the late 60s and early 70s until CCR implodes under the weight of their own personalities. In an unrelated development, the acquisition of Prestige brings in Orrin Keepnews, which has huge implications for the quality of jazz musicians they're able to attract and sign and record. To give you some example of both the quality and the variety of the jazz put out by Fantasy in the 1970s, 1974 alone sees releases by Woody Herman, big band release, Blackbirds, jazz funk, a smooth jazz record from Stanley Turrentine, a kind of soul jazz world music mashup from Letta Mbulu, hard bop from Sonny Stitt, a swing piano record from Duke Ellington, a fusion record from David Axelrod, Latin jazz from Cal Tjader, plus records from Kenny Burrell, Cannonball Adderley, Charlie Byrd, Bill Evans, and Charles Earland. All of this is released in and amongst about a zillion reissues of anything anyone called Fogerty had ever released, plus a bunch of B-list rock and folk. So of the non-1950s releases by these three labels, the most important era by far of any of them is the 1970s period on Fantasy, which has a whole bunch of real gems. Late stage Bill Evans, late stage Cannonball, late stage Ellington, late stage Tjader, Kenny Burrell's work, and the Blackbirds. Lots of variety in late stage Fantasy, and my examples are just a few. Here, not jazz, but I'd throw it in just because it's such a big part of the story of the label, is Green River by CCR. Really, one side of CCR is probably enough for anybody. This wonderful record which I'd mentioned before, by Letta Mbulu, which is, again, kind of a fusion of South African music, soul jazz, and so on. An incredible lineup on here, too. Both Adderley brothers are part of this production. The Blackbirds, I love this cover because of the Van Gogh-ness of it. They were, of course, proteges of Donald Byrd and produced a series of really quite outstanding jazz funk records in the early to mid 70s. And Bill Evans in his later reinventions, a couple of these worthy of note. Intuition with Eddie Gomez, and some of his more experimental work. Some of these he's messing around with the electric piano as well since we met at the Village Vanguard. For the 60s and 70s on fantasy, there is a lot of great material, a lot of variety, a lot of other stuff to wade through too. So if you have thought about that, if you have some opinions on fantasy's later catalog, which is not well formed in my mind for sure, please do add your comments and your thoughts down below. These three labels together made a phenomenal contribution to recorded jazz in the 20th century. And while there are great pieces of music released in several decades by all three labels, it's in the 1950s where the what you might call original contribution of the West Coast scene was made. As Ted Joyce says, that contribution happened because the people behind the labels were willing to take chances repeatedly on things which may or may not be viable, which were artistically exciting, because those same producers refused to be controlling as to the type of jazz being played, and crucially because they refused to be put off by the indifference of the East Coast jazz establishment to the music coming out of the West Coast. Personally, I love the music these labels put out, particularly from the 1950s, and I would love to see it move out further from the shadow of East Coast jazz from the same era. If you look at the cost of original pressings from East Coast and West Coast jazz put out in the 1950s, it's clear that the East Coast stuff is still held in higher esteem by the market. I'm not so sure that's totally warranted. The good news is you can still pick up classic West Coast releases for a fraction of the price of an original Blue Note or Prestige. So not only is this great music, it's still a semi-affordable hobby. So there we are. Thank you very much for watching if you watched this far. It's a real pleasure to do these guides. They obviously take some time to prepare and inevitably will contain a few errors, so please be kind. I'd love to hear your feedback in the comments. And if you have specific things to add, other bits of history or recommendations or corrections to some of the things I've said, that's of great value to anybody who watches this channel. And please do comment, and my thanks in advance for that. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.